No one could explain why the two baby elephants refused to separate, not even for a second. When the rescue team first found them on the dusty road near the forest edge, the calves were shaking badly. Their small bodies were pressed tightly together, their ears low, their trunks wrapped around each other like they were holding on for safety. They were both very young, maybe only a few months old, and they were terrified. At first, the rangers thought it was normal fear. Baby elephants panic easily when they lose their herd. But this was different. Whenever someone tried to guide them apart, even gently, both calves became extremely distressed. Their cries grew louder. Their legs trembled. One of them even tried to climb over the other just to stay close. It was clear they had been through something frightening. The rescue team carefully moved them to a nearby wildlife center where orphaned animals were treated and protected. The place was quiet and safe, surrounded by tall trees and wide open land. But the fear did not leave the calves. That first night was the hardest. The moment darkness spread across the sky, the two young elephants began to panic again. They cried loudly, their small trunks searching the air, their bodies pressing tightly against each other. Caretakers stayed nearby trying to calm them. Nothing worked. Warm milk did not help. Soft voices did not help. Even the gentle touch of the caretakers could not ease their fear. The calves refused to lie down. They stayed standing side by side for hours, swaying slightly as if they were trying to comfort each other. One caretaker, a quiet man named Elias, watched them carefully from across the enclosure. He had worked with rescued animals for many years, but he had never seen two baby elephants so deeply frightened. Something had clearly happened before they were found. Maybe they had been chased. Maybe they had lost their herd suddenly. No one knew. But one thing was obvious. The calves only felt safe when they were touching each other. Late that night, when the other workers had already gone to rest, Elias walked slowly into the enclosure. The moonlight made long shadows across the ground. The two elephants were still standing together, barely moving. Their small eyes looked tired. Their bodies looked cold. Without saying a word, Elias walked back to the storage room nearby. After a moment, he returned carrying something simple. A large brown blanket. It was thick and soft, the kind normally used to keep rescued animals warm during cold nights. Elias stepped closer very slowly so he would not scare them. The calves watched him carefully, their ears twitching. Then, with calm and steady hands, he gently placed the blanket across both of their backs at the same time. The cloth draped over them like a small shelter. For a moment, nothing happened. The calves stayed completely still. Elias quietly stepped back and waited. Then something unexpected happened. The two baby elephants slowly moved closer under the blanket. And for the first time since they arrived, their bodies stopped shaking. The change was small, but everyone noticed it. For the first time since the rescue, the two baby elephants looked calmer. Their bodies were still pressed together under the blanket. Their ears relaxed slightly, and the loud cries that had filled the enclosure all evening slowly faded into soft, tired sounds. Elias stayed nearby, sitting quietly on a wooden stool just outside the fence. He did not move much. He did not speak. He simply watched. The blanket rested across both calves like a shared shelter. When one of them shifted its weight, the other followed, keeping the same small space between them. After several long minutes, something even more surprising happened. One of the calves slowly bent its legs. It lowered its body carefully onto the ground. The second calf hesitated for a moment. It looked around the enclosure, its small eyes wide and unsure. Then it slowly leaned down too, settling beside the first one. The blanket slid gently over their backs as they lay side by side. It was the first time either of them had rested since arriving at the center. Elias let out a quiet breath. The calves were still alert, but the shaking had almost stopped. Their trunks moved slowly across the ground, sometimes touching each other as if checking that the other was still there. The night grew quiet. Crickets chirped in the distance, and a soft wind moved through the trees surrounding the rescue center. For the next hour, the two elephants barely moved. At some point, both of them finally closed their eyes. When the morning caretakers arrived at sunrise, they were surprised by what they saw. The two calves were still lying under the same blanket, their bodies touching, sleeping peacefully in the early morning light. Elias was still sitting nearby. He had not left. Word quickly spread through the rescue center. The young elephants had finally slept. Caretakers stepped closer to observe them carefully. No one wanted to wake them too suddenly. One of the workers gently lifted the edge of the blanket to check their condition. Both calves were breathing slowly and calmly. The deep fear from the night before seemed to have eased, at least for now. Later that morning, the team prepared fresh milk and water for them. As the calves slowly woke up, they stood carefully on their feet again. The blanket slipped off their backs and dropped to the ground. For a moment, the two elephants looked confused. They looked around the enclosure, their ears moving as they listened to the sounds of the new day. Then something simple but touching happened. Both calves lowered their trunks and began pulling the blanket toward themselves again. They stepped close together and stood over it like it belonged to them. The caretakers exchanged surprised looks. It seemed the blanket was no longer just a piece of cloth. For these two frightened animals, it had become something else. Something that made them feel safe. But no one at the rescue center yet understood the real reason why the calves were so deeply afraid. That answer would come later. And when it did, it would explain everything. By the second day, the entire rescue center was talking about the two calves and their blanket. The staff had rescued many young elephants before. Some were injured. Some had lost their mothers. Fear and stress were normal during the first few days. But this situation felt different. These two calves refused to move far from the blanket. Every time the caretakers tried to clean the ground or move the cloth to the side, the calves became nervous again. Their ears spread wide. Their small trunks lifted into the air as they searched for the familiar smell. So the team decided to leave it where it was. The blanket stayed on the ground between them. And strangely, the calves seemed to treat it like a shared shelter. Whenever one of them stepped away to drink milk or water, the other stayed close to the cloth. Then, when the first calf returned, it gently touched the blanket with its trunk before standing beside the other again. It was almost like a silent promise between them. Later that afternoon, the rescue center's head wildlife vet arrived to examine the young elephants. Dr. Mateo had worked with orphaned elephants for over 15 years. He had seen many cases of stress and trauma in young animals. But when he watched the calves for the first few minutes, something caught his attention. The two elephants were not only close to each other. They were always touching the blanket. Sometimes they stood on it. Sometimes they pulled the edge closer with their trunks. And sometimes they simply rested their heads against it. Dr. Mateo crouched near the fence, observing them quietly. The calves did not panic when he came closer. But their eyes remained cautious, as if they were still waiting for danger. After the quick health check, the vet stood up and spoke with the caretakers. The calves were physically healthy. No serious injuries. No broken bones. Just small cuts and signs of exhaustion from the long journey they must have gone through. But their behavior told a deeper story. Something had frightened them badly before they were rescued. That evening, Elias decided to look again at the notes from the rescue team that found them. The report was simple. Two calves had been discovered alone near a dry river path far from the main herd routes. The ground showed signs of panic and struggle. There were broken branches and deep footprints all around. But there was something else written in the notes. Something that no one at the rescue center had paid much attention to before. The rescuers had also found a large torn piece of brown fabric lying near the calves when they were discovered. At the time, the team assumed it had fallen from an old transport truck or from a campsite. So they brought the cloth with them to wrap the cold calves during the long drive back to the center. Elias slowly lowered the paper. His eyes moved toward the enclosure. The same blanket the calves refused to leave was the same piece of fabric found with them at the rescue site. And suddenly a new question appeared. What had really happened to these two elephants before they were found? The answer was about to change everything the rescue team believed about that quiet piece of cloth. That night, the rescue team sat together in the small office near the elephant enclosure. The report from the rescue site was spread across the table. Broken branches. Deep tracks in the dirt. Signs that the calves had been running in panic. And the torn piece of fabric found lying near them. Elias slowly read through the report again. The rescue team had reached the location just before sunset that day. When they arrived, the two calves were standing very close together, shaking and crying loudly. But something in the note stood out more now. The rescuers had written that the calves were already standing beside the fabric when they found them. They were not running. They were not trying to escape. They were standing directly next to the cloth, touching it with their trunks. Almost the same way they were doing now. Dr. Mateo leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. Elephants remember things very clearly, especially when they are young and scared. Sometimes even small objects can become a strong memory if they are connected to safety. But the big question remained. Why that blanket? What had happened before the rescue team arrived? The next morning, Elias made a call to the ranger station closest to the rescue site. He wanted to know if anyone had reported activity in that area during the days before the calves were discovered. The answer came quickly. A small group of wildlife patrol rangers had been in that region 2 days earlier. They had been tracking signs of illegal hunters moving through the forest. The hunters had already left by the time the patrol reached the area. But the rangers had found something troubling. They discovered signs that a group of elephants had been chased through the dry river path. Large footprints showed the herd had scattered in different directions. In the middle of that path there were signs of panic. Branches torn down. Heavy ground marks. Deep tracks from adult elephants running fast. But the rangers also reported something else. Near the same spot where the calves were later found, there were tire marks from a vehicle. And next to those tracks, the rangers saw the remains of a torn brown transport tarp that had fallen from the truck. When Elias heard this, everything suddenly made sense. The blanket in the enclosure was not just a random piece of cloth. It was part of the tarp from the hunter's vehicle. Somehow, during the chaos when the herd ran away, the two calves must have ended up alone near that fallen fabric. In the middle of fear, noise, and confusion, that piece of cloth became the only thing around them that did not move. The only thing that stayed still. The only thing that felt safe. And now, days later, they were still holding on to that memory. But what happened next at the rescue center would surprise everyone even more. After learning what likely happened in the forest, the rescue team began to understand the calves in a completely different way. The blanket was not just something warm. It was the only quiet thing the calves remembered during the moment their world suddenly changed. For them, that cloth meant safety. So the team decided not to take it away. Days passed, and slowly the calves began to settle into life at the rescue center. They started drinking milk more calmly. They walked around the enclosure without panic. Sometimes they even played, gently pushing each other the way young elephants do. But one habit never changed. The blanket always stayed close. If the wind pushed it away, one of the calves would quickly grab it with its trunk and drag it back. If the caretakers folded it to the side while cleaning, the two little elephants would walk over and stand on top of it again. It had become their shared safe place. One evening about a week later, something small but important happened. For the first time since arriving, the calves walked away from the blanket together and began exploring the far end of the enclosure. They moved slowly, touching the trees and sniffing the grass. Their ears moved with curiosity instead of fear. The caretakers watched quietly from the fence. The two calves stayed away for almost 10 minutes. Then slowly they walked back. But this time something was different. They did not rush. They did not panic. They simply returned, stood beside the blanket for a moment, and then walked past it again. It was the first sign they were starting to feel safe without it. Over the next few weeks, the blanket stayed in the enclosure, but the calves depended on it less and less. They played more. They slept without it some nights. They followed the caretakers around during feeding time. Their confidence grew every day. But the team never removed the cloth. It remained there quietly on the ground, a reminder of the strange way these two young elephants had survived their worst moment. A simple piece of torn fabric had become their shield during the most frightening time of their lives. And in the end, it helped them feel safe long enough to begin healing. Sometimes comfort does not come from something big or powerful. Sometimes it comes from the smallest, quietest thing that stayed beside you when everything else disappeared.